One of the most often repeated commands in the collection of books we call the Bible is the command to remember. To remember what this God has done, who this God is, and who you, the reader, God's child, was made to be. The majority of the stories in here are actually Jewish stories. And it's no accident that a Jewish child, such as Jesus of Nazareth, would have grown up memorizing their stories because they helped them to understand who they were made to be. But their God didn't just give them a set of stories, a set of writings. Instead, he gave them things, ceremonies, feasts, festivals, acts of worship, activities to do together. 7 main festivals in the year. And these festivals had a purpose. You can see in a book called Exodus where it describes some of these festivals, and more in Leviticus, where God says, observe this ceremony, the festival, and then when your children ask you, what does this ceremony mean to you, then you tell them. This, for example, is the Passover sacrifice to God, who passed over the houses of the Israelites in Egypt and spared our homes when he struck down the Egyptians and freed us from slavery. What it doesn't say is, if the children ask questions, then this is what you say. It says, when the children ask questions. Questions are expected. Questions are encouraged. People in this community, in this church, are probably sick of my love of questions. But read through these stories. Read the story of Jesus of Nazareth, and you'll see that this God loves questions, actively encourages questions, loves it when his people actually wrestle or argue with him because they are involved in some way. And so these festivals, these acts of worship that the community do together, were ways to reenact, to remember, and to provoke questions. The children weren't told what to think. They weren't told the answers. Instead, life was organised to encourage them to ask questions. In a book called Deuteronomy, one of the core Jewish commands about remembering, it says, these commandments, this way of life, that I give you today are to be upon your hearts. Impress them on your children. Talk about them when you sit at home, when you walk along the road, when you lie down, and when you get up. That means all the time. Passing on the story was not done at a set time, in a class, or in a particular institution, or in a particular space in the week, but it was part of everyday life, a life of questions and answers and stories and acts that happen together. A few years ago, a man called Westerhoff took a long, hard look at what the Christian church was doing with children. And he wrote this. He said, the church has so often tried to copy the school, the education system, and tried to improve it, tried to be the same as it, or tried to be better at it, copy its methods, trying to teach religion, teach morals. But instead, it has not passed on the faith. The church shouldn't try and be a school. But instead, the church is and should be a community that passes on the faith. And that, he said, is done not by a teacher, not in a class, not by any one person, but by a whole community. This is not new. It's there in the Jewish stories. And it's important. Faith is not about information. It's not about convincing someone with data. It's not about persuading. Faith is something each of us discovers. And so the point isn't to convince someone, to make someone, but instead to pass on good news that I have discovered about life, about creation, about God, about relationships, about my place in the world. Look at the stories of Jesus of Nazareth. He seems more interested in including people, in demonstrating who God is and what God is doing, in encouraging or even asking himself lots of questions, in inviting the people he meets into the life he's living. He's far more interested in those things than in converting anyone with information or forcing anyone to do anything. a passionate follower of Jesus called Paul, writes in one of his letters in Thessalonians, "We loved you so much that we were delighted to share with you not only the gospel, the good news of God, but our lives as well, because you'd become so dear to us." Paul was also a teacher, but his method was the same as the Jesus method. His way of passing things on was to share his whole life. And this lived life method of sharing poured out of him in the way it poured out of Jesus. It invited the people around to be immersed in what God was doing, and they couldn't help but ask questions, get involved, and Paul and Jesus and many other Jesus followers couldn't help but pass on their faith. Because passing on your faith is not just a command, it's a privilege. It's impossible actually not to do, if indeed it is good news. It's a way of life, and it takes a whole community. We believe here that it takes a whole church to raise a child. We're made to be a community, to discover this together, to be a family, to be together a blessing in this place. And we each have a part to play in that, in loving God, in loving our neighbours, in encouraging questions, in sharing our lives with each and every generation so that we each can know this story, our story, and understand who we were made to be. Jesus of Nazareth, in one of the 4 stories of his life and his death and his resurrection, in Luke chapter 8, tells a story about seeds. And it's about a man sowing seeds, and some of them falling on certain kinds of ground and other kinds of grounds, and some growing and some not. And I used to hear that story and think that I was someone who sowed seeds, told people about Jesus, and then I just hoped that in their life they would be good soil. But I've looked at that story again and I've changed my mind. I've realised that Jesus is the sower. It's his story, it's his way. Those are the seeds, the good news. And he is sowing the seeds. And my role, in fact, our role, is not to be a good sower when what is needed is good soil. And I think the best soil is a community who is passionate about the Jesus way, who is interested in the next generation, who listens, who cares, and, like good soil, bears fruit. And I think that means being part of what God is doing in the world, God's project of healing and forgiving and loving and feeding and caring and making things back to the way they were made to be. So let us be people who question. Let us be good soil in this place. Here in Banchory, where the seeds of the Jesus way, of the Jesus story, can take roots in people's lives and then flourish in all the lives that we get to share in. Let's be good soil. Let's not be afraid together to get our hands dirty and be good soil together.